Okay, 10-second warning.
Okay. Hi, hello, and firstly, thank you all of you for tuning in on time and welcome to today's eBaithak on civic participation and policy design with Antaraa Vasudev. We have her already in the room, but before we give the stage to her, I'll quickly introduce what's this eBaithak about and some housekeeping rules. So, in this, we're going to talk about organizations and startups working on participatory policy making in India and also abroad. We're also going to explore the challenges in ensuring constructive dialogue between government and the citizens and how we can contribute and participate in the process. Just some housekeeping rules that make sure the mic is turned off at all times and your video is also off. I'm sure you will have a lot of questions when Nandara will be speaking, so we'll give you a link in the chat box. Please put all your questions there, and by the end of the eBaithak, which is in the last 10-15 minutes, we'll make sure that these questions are catered to. One of my colleagues will put the link in the chat box. Do click on that link and send your questions. Now, before I give the stage to Antara, I'll request Yazad Jal, the director of CCS Academy, to introduce her, and then the discussion can take forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astha. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Antaraa Vasudev. Antaraa is an experimenter in the civic technology space and the founder of Civis, a nonprofit which enables the government to understand the citizens' priorities and give their feedback to policy decisions in real time. She has previously worked at the international nonprofit Asia Society, where she handled policy-related public education programs, as well as track 2 dialogues between ministers in the Union Council of Ministers, as well as with Kevin Rudd, the 16th Prime Minister of Australia. In addition to her work at Asia Society, she has volunteered for global civic technology platform democracy.earth. She started her career understanding how technology can drive civic engagement at Niti Digital. She is driven to help build trust between citizens and government through the use of technology. So this is a fascinating topic for me. How can we engage citizens using technology? And I'm going to hand it over to Antaraa, who is going to take us through it all. Over to you, Antaraa.
Thank you, Yazad. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Special thanks to Yazad, Astha, Krish, and the team at CCS who was very ably put together this evening. Happy Makar Sankranti before I begin. And thank you again for taking out the time to be with us today. So as Yazad had mentioned, I have a background in civic technology, and I have been working for many years trying to understand how citizens and governments can work together and how we can build trust and dialogue between citizens and governments. So as we go ahead with this evening, I thought it would be interesting for me to quickly give an introduction on this concept called civic technology. Some of us who are even practitioners in this space find it quite amorphous and confusing, and then transition from that into what is participatory policy formation, how does it work in India, and then I hope to leave you with many questions, and I'm looking forward to keeping this as interactive as possible. So as Astha had mentioned, please do put your questions in the link, and I would be really interested to know what I can answer and how we can take this forward. So without further ado, let me just begin presenting my screen. Asta, if you could just let me know.
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Okay, fantastic. So before we begin, just a quick introduction. Civis is the Latin root word for citizen, and the citizen is at the center of everything that we do. What I wanted to talk about before is just a little bit about what Civis does. At Civis, we really believe that each one of us knows what is best for our communities, and we empower individuals to co-create laws that impact them with the government before these laws are actually finalized. So for example, there is a particular regulation on responsible artificial intelligence, and given the current dilemma around WhatsApp versus Signal and data privacy, artificial intelligence and responsible AI is becoming more and more important in today's day and age. So you can actually come in and share your feedback on laws like this. But this is not all that civic technology is all about. In fact, it's a huge and very, very vast and diverse domain. So I'm going to take you back in time, way back in time, to about 1436, when we saw the disruptor, quote unquote, in the civic technology space, which was the printing press. So let's go back in time, and the reason I will slowly come to demystifying why I'm going back so far. But I think one of the key ideas that we have to think about is that how technology, even be it the printing press, has actually evolved our relationship with the state and our relationship with those who are around us, right? So when the printing press was invented, it was revolutionary because it started actually ensuring that there was a lot of widespread dissemination of information that was earlier very siloed or very kept to a certain group of people. Now with the revolution of the printing press, it became such that you could get news faster. So more than just being a passive participant in the state framework, you are now given the tools to be able to push for accountability, for example. And that is something that is quite interesting, and at that time was quite revolutionary as well. I will now skip a little bit to come to what is happening happening more so in today's day and age. So while Gutenberg's printing press was revolutionary in information dissemination, the internet has been a new disruptor in two-way communication. So I'm sure all of us are now tired, or not so tired, but I'm sure all of us are a little bit tired of the Zoom calls and family tambola evenings that are all happening on Zoom, right? And one would think, oh man, I really wish Zoom just hadn't happened. But it's really interesting to see that this is a form of two-way communication, be it internally amongst our loved ones, be it with our teams and co-workers, or even be it with the government to a certain extent. Now, you may not use Zoom in that particular scenario, but the idea is that now with the proliferation of the internet, we have the tools to be able to say, for example, tweet a complaint to the railway ministry, and the Ministry of Railway has a process to take that through the channel and actually make sure that your complaint gets resolved, right? We've heard some incredible stories of civic engagement in this manner actually bearing fruit very quickly. And lost items being returned to passengers, or things like that, which were earlier completely not possible, just by virtue of building a tool for communication and building a tool for resolution of certain complaints. So what I have up here is something called a concept called new power, which is to me exceptionally fascinating, and is something that actually forms a basis of why civic technology and why civic technology works. So old power values are those which are perhaps more top down, which actually view the state as something where you would, say, for example, pay your taxes and get a certain amount of services, or that you would be more or less happy with the status quo. But what we're seeing now, and specifically amongst people under the ages of 35, is that there is a new set of new power values which are coming out. Now, new power values are ones where decisions are not unilateral, decisions are not top down, but are actually bottom up and have some amount of collaboration between stakeholders on ground and those who are making the decisions, right? So while old power was more in favor of, say, representative governance, new power is actually in favor of something called network governance. And I'll come back to this because there's a very interesting example here. Whereas old power was perhaps focused on resource consolidation, new power is focused on open source collaboration, taking innovation across borders. The very evolution of the internet, right, is an exciting and fascinating story in how new power works and how collaboration actually works. And this collaboration doesn't have to be just in the private sphere or in the professional sphere. It can actually be in the civic sphere. And that's what we're going to go into slightly deeper. The third thing is new power actually focuses on radical transparency. Now, the words radical and transparency together often will spark images of some sort of a revolt, but it's not that. It's just that there is a lot of open dissemination of information. There is the ability to share information. And in that, we are ourselves creating more transparency, not just about external institutions, but about our own lives, about the ways in which we are choosing to live our lives. And that is a very typical new power value. The last two are also quite interesting, so I'm going to spend a second to go into them. While old power values actually focused on specialization, it is seen the new power values actually focus on a maker culture or a do-it-yourself culture, right? Because the internet and the tools that we have been provided with the advancements in technology are so new that oftentimes we find that upskilling ourselves to be able to adapt to these roles is perhaps a very interesting and meaningful way to actually engage and be involved or have greater professional success. For example, the I policy, or now the E policy that CCS holds, is one such way of upskilling, right? It may not be that I have a political science degree, but now I can reach out to an organization, get involved with their programs completely by myself, and get an understanding of what the space is. So that comes under the do-it-yourself maker culture, which is not as perhaps structured as having a field of specialization, which used to happen in the past. Um, and one interesting factor is the change in levels of participation. So while earlier we would have less overall participation, now we see that is actually more overall participation. And the authors of this particular work of research and this book, Jeremy Hymans and Henry Timms, go on to say that in the coming generations, they foresee that participation will be the norm. So what's really interesting is that first we were getting information and we were just subject to this information. Now we can also get information and give information. We can engage, right? But until and unless this engagement is really structured or done in a very effective and efficient way, what we'll end up with is perhaps a little bit of a mess. So if the future generations are going to see participation as their right, or as something where they feel they are entitled to that, if we don't create the systems now to make the matching of minds, we'd probably be in a little bit of trouble. But anyway, I'm going to pause there to just say that that is a little bit of what civic technology is about. But I'm going to go deeper into the definitions and understanding it now. Right. So, what is civic technology? Now, if you ask the internet this question, it will give you 100 different answers. If you ask practitioners this question, there will be 100 different answers. But for the sake of convenience, I'm going with the definition that I personally relate to the most, right? So, civic technology is technology that is used to empower citizens and to help make governance more accessible, efficient, and effective. So this is one definition that has come up from Omidyar Network, which is a philanthropic investment firm that actually invests quite a bit in civic technology. Now, this could be a number of different ways it could really manifest, and it could be radically different what our idea of civic technology is vis-a-vis what the ideas are in the United States, right? To give you an example, in the US, one of the very interesting startups is called vote.com, or vote.org, sorry, and it works with voter enrollment. Now, something similar, and actually takes through the entire process. Something similar may not work in the same way in India, because there are different norms and different rules, right? So there is very different contexts, and I think that is why sometimes the big question of what is civic technology gets to be a little bit confusing. But think about it this way: citizen state, and how can you make that relationship more accessible, efficient, and effective? So I mentioned an example from the US, but what I want to highlight here, and this map is thanks to an incredible organization called Civic Tech Field Guide. Let's take a look at the widespread proliferation of civic technology globally. So we have a number of organizations in the United States, a number of organizations in countries like France. We have organizations based in Iceland which are running consultations and participatory governance in countries across the world, right? So this is one very, very interesting perspective on how civic technology has been growing. Now, the advent of civic technology in India itself is started with Janagraha, which is an incredible organization working on urban governance and technology and civic participation, right? So Janagraha has been in India. I will I may not get this exactly right, but at least for the past 16 to 17 years. And it's incredible to know that while this concept has been evolving, we have one of the pioneers sitting based out of Bangalore, working across the country and doing some really, really incredible work. I'll come to India specific work in just a few minutes. But before then, essentially, what I also wanted to use this opportunity to highlight is that civic technology has seen a great rise. And I used to have a different version of this map that I used to look at. And today, in preparation for this presentation, I went and took another look at it. And I was surprised to see how much the numbers have grown. Now, what has been really interesting is that there has been a great proliferation of civic technology ventures, of organizations, nonprofits, and Civis. We ourselves are a nonprofit, but it could take very different shapes and forms. Um, Specifically during the pandemic, technology has been used in very new and interesting ways. And of course, if you have any ideas or thoughts on which platforms you have seen use technology during the pandemic, do put them in the link that Asta had shared. I'd be very curious to know. But essentially, in countries like Taiwan, which has a digital engagement officer, they actually have a cabinet level official who is focused on digital engagement. They were actually able to use and leverage technology very effectively to combat the outcomes of the pandemic. Now, this particular digital engagement officer has a very, very interesting story. Um, they were an activist group that started something called G0V, which that's G0V Taiwan, which actually decided to get a group of citizens together to be hacktivists. Now, hacktivists are individuals who kind of put together quick solutions for civic problems, right? So it wasn't anything fancy. It may not have been had the best interface. It might have been really clunky, but at the same time, they got very, very good at solving civic problems in short periods of time. And that actually got them a seat at the table to have their leader be a part of Taiwan's digital engagement ministry, right? So that's really fascinating stuff. Now, during the pandemic, they were actually able to use that culture of hacktivism that they had created to be able to develop solutions that could perhaps ensure privacy of individuals, could ensure proliferation of medical equipment. And as we all know, the Taiwan story with the pandemic has been very, very encouraging to see how governments can come together and work very quickly. Closer to home, two incredible organizations, three actually. One that I already mentioned, Janagraha, really used the pandemic as an opportunity to ensure that community policing was happening in a more structured way. I believe early into the pandemic, they had over 35,000 people who were accessing their platform to understand what are the resources I can use as an individual in the city. And similarly, an organization called Reap Benefit was doing some incredible work where they actually mobilized young people to go out and share their inputs on, or actually go out and share how their resources. So it could be distributing rations, or it could be educating communities about usage of masks. All of that was done by a group of young people in Bangalore. They created a dashboard from scratch, which said, okay, here are where the hospitals are, here are where the non-COVID hospitals are. So incredible stuff. Similarly, organizations like Hak Darshak and e-governments foundation, which actually helped create different tools for the government to be able to respond quickly to the pandemic. All of them have been hard at work in tandem with the government, in tandem with civil society organizations, to really be able to make sure that technology is used effectively, so that such change or such interventions can really be scaled. So with that, I hope I've provided a little bit of a glimpse into what civic technology is all about, and looking forward to your questions as we go on. But before that, I also just wanted to highlight some of the work that has been done by an organization called Knight Foundation. My hope here is also to just show you who are the big players globally in civic technology from an investment and research point of view. But a Knight Foundation has, in 2013, created this map, which actually visualizes civic technology resources in government. So you'll see here that their definition of civic technology is quite different. So they have person-to-person or peer-to-peer local sharing. So I can put up, supposing I have a used bicycle which I want to share or rent out. That could be one use of civic technology. They also have a lot of data visualization, data access and transparency. They have neighborhood forums, which are really pushed forward. So over here, what you'll see is there's two concentric circles, and the concentric circle in blue and pink actually show you how the investments have been made in these spaces. There's also a small, tiny little circle, which I'm hoping has grown in influence since 2013, called public decision making. And that is the one which actually focuses on citizens engaging and participating in the policy creation process. I've, through this conversation, also spoken about a few organizations working in the civic technology space, but I'll take a minute more to just speak about some findings that Omidyar Network, CIIE, and Village Capital had in their most recent report on the civic technology space in India. They saw that there were about 450 to 475 civic technology startups, which includes waste management, which includes complaint redressal, which includes organizations like Civis as well. They found that there were basically two broad categories within civic tech in India. One is service delivery, where you would see, for example, organizations like waste disposal that are working on those areas come under the service delivery bucket. Whereas the second one is citizens engagement, where organizations like us, Janagraha, Reap Benefit, and others would come in. There's also, interestingly, a lot of for-profit startups that are working in the civic technology space. So you may know Mobisai, which is a bicycle renting company, or you may have heard of Civil Cops, which is a back-end artificial intelligence tool for municipalities. There are a lot of very, very interesting organizations that are also for-profit in this space. Would it be predominantly non-profit? I think it's about I would say a 60-40 split. 60% are for-profit, whereas 40% are non-profit organizations in this space. An interesting thought or finding in this report was the fact that 50% of respondents actually believed that civic technology will help strengthen trust and in government and its services. Now, I know that putting the stat here is just my own personal bias because of how interested I am in building trust, but this is one of the things also that I thought was interesting to highlight. Now, I'll quickly come to what Civis does and what participatory policy could look like in India. And then we will have some time for questions as well. So essentially, Civis is anchored in a particular policy known as the pre-legislative consultation policy. Now, this mouthful is is a little bit of a superpower that we as individuals have in our country, right? So what do I mean by this? Now, I think as citizens in our citizen toolbox, we have some really, really great tools. The RTI is one of them. But to my mind, equally important is something known as the pre-legislative consultation policy. For the sake of my own respiratory system and not running out of breath saying the whole phrase over and over, I'm just going to call it PLCP, but don't get confused. I'm essentially talking about the same policy. So what does this mean? Now, what this really means is that it gives us as individuals the ability to share feedback on laws before they get passed. So now, mostly what tends to happen is that we realize after the fact that, oh, okay, this is a law that will, for example, change my driving license card, or will do different aspects or different things. But we don't often realize that ever since 2014, we have had the opportunity to actually share our inputs on these laws. And Civis is really looking to make that process a lot more seamless. How we're looking to do that is, we are working to aggregate all open policies so that people like us know when a law is seeking our feedback. Secondly, we are also looking to simplify and translate these laws and policies, because man, sometimes it gets so technical, even I'm at sea, right? And I can't comment on something that I don't really understand. So we actually simplify and translate these particular policies. After that, we work to ensure that we gather feedback from relevant stakeholders on a particular law. And then lastly, that we build government capacity. Because see, it's not a one-sided problem, right? We have to be exceptionally empathetic to the governments as well, who have very limited capacity but are really working overtime to run the country the way that they do. And over here, what I wanted to mention is that essentially we work with both sides to make sure that it's not just feedback that is bouncing off an open wall, right? It's actually inputs that can be made sense of, that can be taken into account, and that can actually have some impact. Because at the end of the day, we really do know very, very well about what is happening in our localities and how we want policies to be shaped. Now, one thing that we face quite often is that oftentimes people will say that, oh, I'm not qualified, but it really needs no qualification. What it needs is a lived experience. So if I know that, for example, that a lot of migrant health workers come into my city at a particular month, and if I want to provide affordable healthcare to them, the number of beds should be more in that particular month when the influx is larger as compared to in another month. And this is actually a point of feedback that we got, and that has been implemented in a particular law, right? So I've gone quite in depth into this. I'm happy to share the presentation after, but essentially the policy itself states that every government department has to proactively publish and seek feedback. Now, India is joining the leagues of countries like South Africa, the United Kingdom, and other countries which have been conducting such public consultations for a very, very long time. There is, in fact, and I'm very sorry I missed putting that link into this presentation, but there is in fact an organization called GovLab, which has seen that there are about between 50 to 70 organizations within the domain of civic technology that are just working on participatory policy formation. Now, some of them are crowdsourcing inputs, so they are asking citizens for feedback. Some of them are working specifically on laws and policies. The others are working on participatory budgeting. So there is this global sort of proliferation of organizations that are also working within civic technology specifically on participatory policy formation. So I will now just quickly emphasize some of the statistics and some of the research on this particular policy. In their analysis, Sushmita Patel and Arun PS have seen that between 2014 and 19, there were 44 bills that were placed for public consultation out of what was conducted in the parliament session. So there was a total of 186 bills, out of which 24 were placed in the public domain for consultation, but weren't placed for a 30-day consultation window. Within that, there was a complete consultation with 20 bills, where those were actually placed for consultation for a full 30 days, giving people time to respond. That was data up until 2019. Now, when we see in the budget session of 2020, we already see that things are changing a lot. 21 bills, of course, were not circulated for consultation, but the fact that 6 bills were circulated for consultation, notwithstanding 30 days, whereas 9 bills have actually completed their consultations. That is a very, very encouraging statistic, because now, year on year in parliament sessions, we are seeing that more bills are seeking our feedback. Aside from the bills, also rules are seeking our feedback. So there are different aspects of the policy formation process that are actually getting published proactively and are actually seeking our inputs on those as well. All very good signs, because it shows that there is a lot more proliferation and belief in collaborating with citizens on particular laws and policies. So that is something that I wanted to highlight. And what we've seen is actually there's been 111% year-on-year growth in the number of consultations that governments put out. And I want to close this out, and I have just maybe 1 or 2 more slides to go. I'm very mindful of the time and the questions, but essentially I wanted to share one story that is personally really heartwarming, and I think is something that demonstrates how such engagements can work. So I want to tell you the story of Bonita, who is a transgender woman who participated in 2 consultations on Civis on the transgender persons' protections of rights rules, right? So there was in 2019 an act which was passed, which was heavily contested by the community. In May 2020, there was a set of rules that were passed that were very similar to the act itself, practically taking what the act had to say and converting it into a set of rules. We saw that a lot of members of the transgender community came in to come and comment on this particular consultation. And by July 2020, there was a new set of rules that were passed, very quick turnaround. And what we saw that 52% of the feedback that was given on Civis was actually accepted. And there were a lot of other contentious provisions that the community was not very much for, that were incorporated into the final policy design, right? So this story makes me want to do a little bit of a jig and say this works, but I will sit tight in my seat. There's one interesting thing that I wanted to point out with relation to this story. If you look at Bonita's language in May 2020, she says scrap the bill, rightly so, right? Whereas if you look at her language in July 2020, which is after the amendments were made, she actually goes on to say that we acknowledge and appreciate the efforts that were made, but this is not ideal. We need XYZ and ABC more, right? So just in terms of how we communicate, so much can change if we actually engage with the governments and see a positive response. So with that, I will just kind of come to a quick slide on how we can contribute. You can actually spread awareness about the pre-legislative consultation policy, about the domain of civic technology, and how each of us can engage with the state in different ways. Now, sharing feedback on laws may not be our cup of tea, totally okay, but you could actually report potholes. If you're in Bangalore right now, there is a participatory budgeting effort. I'm not sure if it's it's currently open, but it was until very recently where Janagraha is getting inputs on public urination spots or white spots or yellow spots as they call it in the city, and aiming to actually help the BBMP with their budget. There's a similar participatory budgeting exercise that's happening in Mumbai on public health. And I think all of these avenues are incredible ways to engage, right? The fact that we're all here instead of celebrating Makar Sankranti, I know you're already sold on the concept of civic engagement and participation. So I'm not going to go deeper into that. But I think there is so much interesting stuff that's happening here, that do roll up your sleeves, engage in any way that you can, and also feel free to reach out if there are ideas that you have or concepts that you have that you'd like to perhaps discuss. I'm most active on Twitter, but we'll come to that. We'll come to that right at the end. I'm going to stop sharing now. Asta, if we have some questions, should we go ahead?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Antaraa, we have a lot of questions, but before we dive in, I think firstly, thank you so much for doing this. I mean, personally, I've also seen an increase in citizens' curiosity with engaging with the government, but then how do we do it? And there are so many organizations that you name. Personally, I've been following Haq Darshak and Reap Benefit and Hidden Squares Pockets and everything. But then there's so many processes which are complicated, which seems to us, but then it seems so easy with your presentation. And that one nitty-gritty where, Bonita's language you've pointed out, which makes all the difference when you're engaging with the government. So based on that, actually, there's this one question by someone on referendum. Like you talked about the PLCP approach, if I'm not wrong. So the person asking, is a referendum type approach to policy design feasible in a country this size?
Right. So that's a really interesting question. I'm going to tie it into one of the big challenges that civic technology also faces in India, right? Which is just the vast difference in language, in cultures across the country, right? So if you see the civic technology map that I showed, there was a lot of proliferation of civic technology in Europe as well as in the US, and I personally believe one of the big reasons for that is homogeneity in language and homogeneity in general culture of a particular country, right? Why that matters when it comes to the question of referendum, I think it is very important for us to participate within the representative system in an effective manner, right? We can't, because of the diversity of our country, and it's a hugely rich asset that we have, we can't perhaps open it out to absolutely open referendum in my mind, because we need to always protect for majoritarianism in any way, shape or form that it might come. Right? Today, I might not be, just to give you an example, a random example. If I have not met or engaged with a person who is a transgender, I do not understand their considerations and where they are coming from, I might outright say that this particular thing should just not be done, it's not needed, right? Just because I don't understand that context. And I think that is one of perhaps the dangers of referendum in some way. I don't want to use the word dangers, but you understand where I'm coming from on this. I think, yeah, there are ways to ensure participation within representation, and I think that is a very crucial next step for us to evolve to that level of maturity to be able to consider referendums.
Okay, thank you. And I think with referendum, another point that comes to my mind is a lot about collective will, right? That how will there be a representation of the majority of the will and who defines the majority and everything like that. So the question says, is it possible to communicate the collective will or even marshal a collective view to bring about a change given the population size and diversity?
I think it's very possible. I mean, I think one of the most heartening, fascinating, incredible demonstrations of this is the movement of RTI, right? Why is it that, for example, PLCP is not so known, but everybody on this call would know the RTI, would know the broad framework of how it came out? It's really, really incredible because that came from a marshalling of the people. And that is a tool, and I really believe that more policy does need to be made in that way, because that is how we get not just involved with the system, but we also take ownership of the system. Now, the state could give us 100 different tools to be in our citizen toolbox, right? Will we use all of them? Probably not. I mean, it depends on our level of activity, the amount of time that we have, and all of those are very valid concerns, right? I mean, sometimes I worry that when I speak, I might just sound a little preachy. I'm not. It's really valid to not have the time to engage at some point, but be able to engage in a different way at another point, right? But that collective will comes together, and there's been many examples of it. Be it the Internet Freedom Foundation, be it the recent EIA consultation that took place. It's happening, and it's really exciting. So.
Perfect. Just one question from my side as a follow-up. So you spoke about network governance also, but like you spoke about RTI, we all know the weakening of RTI in the current times. Even though we want to engage with the government actively, the government, I think, is putting efforts to kind of stop that. So how as organizations do we ensure that government also are active towards that? And especially citing an example where government websites are like really slow, and I think they're made in such a way that we do not engage with government websites. So how is that problem tackled?
Right. So I think really interesting question there, Asta. I think what is also happening is that we need to see where governments are engaging. And the reason that I focus on this a lot is because there is a lot of popular perception that governments don't engage, so it's not worth my time, right? But what we don't realize, and I was citing this example a little while ago as well, if we're concerned about air pollution in Delhi, just to give a random example, what we don't realize is that the pollution cloud is not going to stop at the Haryana border and turn back and say, this is not my jurisdiction, right? There is going to be a little bit of a crossover that happens. And if we're looking at air pollution in Delhi, it's not just the Delhi government's effort. It needs to be the Punjab government, the Haryana government, and a lot of other state governments that need to work, each of which will have panchayats under them. They will have their own district setups. They will have urban governance. All of them need to come together in tandem to be able to deliver a result of lesser air pollution in Delhi. Right. So the reason why I say that let's and I know it's not always practical, but the reason why I say it's worth making that little bit of an effort and worth having a little bit of perseverance is because there are many complex systems that are at an interplay here. Think about it almost like a duty of some sorts, right? Like we go and vote irrespective. Our candidate gets elected or doesn't get elected, we go and vote, and that is somewhat like a duty of a kind that we need to do. The more and more that we start engaging and we start understanding the system, the more and more avenues will pop up for us to understand how to utilize the system as well. What's happening right now, and Asa, this may not be for some people on the call, but also a broader perception that the system doesn't work, so it's not worth engaging with, is what is hampering us from even getting to that half step or that one step level where we start engaging.
Talking about the avenues, I think internet is one of the biggest avenue through which we try and engage as citizens. So the question from one of the participants here says, do you think there are fears of the internet civic engagement distorting democracy, that is misinforming civic opinion and thereby policy?
Mm-hmm. Interesting question. So at the time that I started working with an organization based in Argentina called Democracy OS, it was early 2015. The Arab Spring was actually happening, and I think that's where the bubbles of technology and democracy don't work well together was starting to kind of come up, right? From that entire episode, one of the things that I thought was very interesting was that technology is here to stay, right? Social media is here to stay. How is it that we can actually mold our systems to be able to accommodate that into their own existing workflows, rather than say that perhaps these two may not actually go well together? Now, of course, what we're seeing with social media and what we're seeing with platforms is a lot of friction in some ways between governance and technology. So it's not that that's not a concern. It's very much a concern. But the questions are, I mean, and I really have no answers here. I'm just kind of putting in my two bits. But the questions here really are: will we, as a citizenry, for example, say that I'm okay with seeing tweets after 30 minutes after they have been moderated, or I am okay with signing up to be a Wikipedia moderator, or I'm okay to pay for Facebook? Like, don't show me any advertisements on WhatsApp. Take 300 rupees a month from me, right? Or whatever that subscription might be. Those are the things that we need to start thinking about now. And that piece of the dialogue will only happen after we see the full extent of how technology and democracy interplay.
Perfect.
And I think we're getting there. I think we're slowly
Yeah.
getting there to be able to make those decisions.
Yeah, as a follow-up question on the internet and the question from one of the participants again, it says that do you think the increase of fake news and demise of fact-check local news, such as the local newspapers, do you think that is a problem?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I think fake news is a massive problem. And I know that for any of us on this call who have tried to explain to our parents, for example, that what comes on WhatsApp is not the holy grail and the truth, right? Is will understand the frustration of what fake news is all about. And when it comes to deep fake videos, it is really a challenge. But what's interesting in all of this, and tying back to the last question as well, is that having gone through this, and coming back to the perspective of new power, right? Having gone through this, I feel like a lot of people in the younger generations are making informed choices about supporting a news publication that is independent, or actually perhaps educating people about the challenges of fake news. All of that is happening because we've kind of lived through the curve of this. So I think, yes, it's a huge problem. Whoever asked that question, please do start figuring out a way how to fix it, because
I think all of us need it. Yeah. Okay, just shifting the conversation a little bit from here. So I'm just going to combine two questions which say that how do we educate the people before we ask them to weigh in on critical policy issues? And how do we overcome apathy from citizens and make them participate more in the civic issues and the political issues?
right. So both very interesting questions. Education. Coming back to the story that I had mentioned about the city of Gurgaon, where we had the migrant workers, the gentleman who answered that question literally looked at me, and the first thing he said to me in this entire conversation is, "Beta, mujhe zyada kuch malum nahi hai. I don't know much," right? And it was really surprising to me to see that a person who says that they don't know much actually managed to weigh in on something that is now saving the GMDA and the Gurugram municipality a lot of resources and money, and is being able to actually effectively utilize whatever resources they have. Um, yes, there needs to be a lot more civic education, but oftentimes if you're so married to the topic, right? Like, for example, I'm sure people on this call have a much better idea or would have some really interesting ideas on how civic technology or civic participation can work differently. But if you're married to the topic, chances are that you may not see what is sitting right in front of your face, right? So what I really emphasize is that while education is important, what is also equally important is actually being able to convey your lived experiences. And this opportunity only arises when somebody acts as the translator. Because if we'd taken this suggestion verbatim to the government, they would have been like, this doesn't make sense, what is this gentleman saying? But if you actually translate it in a way that can make sense to the government, that's when it actually translates into some sort of impact. That brings me to the second question. The second question was on how do you combat apathy. it's really hard. No easy solutions there. But one thing that we have seen, and we're really trying very hard to work on, is that what happens if we actually make it such that your feedback is acknowledged, that you know that something that you said didn't just go into this black hole of government functioning and nothing happened of it, even though you spent 2.5 hours, reading the policy carefully. And 2.5 hours is like the top end. I saw a few surprised faces, but it's basically like it takes about 10 minutes to actually do the entire process. But if you're super diligent, and you want to go through all of the documents and read everything, it might take you an hour or two. And you've done all of that effort, and then nothing has happened. And that's really disheartening. And even for me, I know that I wouldn't come back to the platform and engage if nothing happens, right? But what happens if you get a comment from somebody that says, hey, this is actually a really interesting point of view? Or what happens if the government gets back to you saying, hi, thank you so much for sharing your feedback. It's going to be a while. It'll probably take us 2 years to finalize this particular thing. But your voice has been heard, your inputs have been taken into account, and that is how we are kind of taking this forward, right? It might help, it may not help, but we're trying to see if it helps. And I think that level of accountability, or response, or closing that loop is exceptionally important. And without that, the apathy will only continue, because it's not our responsibility, for example, to keep tracking these things and seeing what happened to the Delhi trees policy, which actually got was open for consultation in 2019, got passed in 2020. We don't have time, and that's okay. But that's why platforms like ours are really trying to bridge those gaps, close those loops, and make sure that you're learning something, or you're engaging in a positive way, or the fact that you actually get some amount of response to be able to combat that apathy.
Perfect. And I think speaking of government's response and how that can actually uplift your, movements that you're trying to do with seeking responses from government. So a question on that is that do you think over time the government in India has become more responsive to civic participation in policy making, or is it still operating in fringes?
Interesting question. I think there are champions within the government who are doing a fantastic job of ensuring civic participation. The number of champions is growing, which is also very encouraging, right? But like I said, there are multiple levels of governance, and value needs to be shown at each level of governance for governments to actually be more forthcoming. So from our own personal experience at Civis, we have actually seen that a lot of government organizations or officers in the government have reached out to us to say, hi, we want to do consultations well. We just don't have the mechanism to be able to do it. Can you help us? And of course, they didn't say hi, but that's just me, adding my own masala to the story, But basically, they have reached out to us a lot, and they continue to reach out to us a lot, because 111% year on year, lakhs of feedback points coming back on consultations, no dedicated consultation officer, not a single person who has the dedicated time and resource to make sense of 2 lakh inputs that came on, or 20 lakh inputs that came on the EIA, right? There is a lot of capacity building that needs to be done on that front as well. Otherwise, this will remain one of the fringe duties. But to that extent, I would like to say that we have, at least in personal experience, seen a lot of people reaching out and wanting to do the process well, and actually accessing reports, seeing them over time, and reaching out to us to say, thank you for submitting your feedback, right? So it's changing, and hopefully it'll change more and more for the better soon.
Yeah. So while we are on this topic, do you think civic engagement works better with decentralized governance?
Interesting question. Yes and no. Yes, because decentralized governance, for example, we've actually seen in Janagraha's example, reap benefit, but also globally, a lot of very successful civic technology interventions come out at the very local level, at the hyper local level, with wards, for example, or at the city level. But at the same time, given the federated structure, it is not that the person who you're reaching out to at the ward level is going to be the person who will be able to answer or be able to actually solve that point of friction for you, right? That is something that might come from the central level or the state level. And that is the reason why I think, yes, possibly, but also no, because in certain domains, like for example, with Civis, not a lot of consultations come from the local level. Consultations typically come from the state or center, right? So by that nature of the work of wanting to be involved in policy formation, by default, we have to be involved at a larger level. So jury's out on that one.
Okay. Since you also spoke about collaborative approach in approaching policy, a question says, how is it possible that people and systems with different value converge towards a common consensus using some intelligently designed civic society platforms?
So the question was, how does that?
How do people possibly, collaborate who have different values and work towards a common cause?
Right. So that's a very interesting question. So I think to give you an example, for the EIA, which is one particular consultation recently that I have been mentioning on this call as well, we saw that a number of mining conglomerates from across the country also wanted to come in and share their feedback on the AIA, right? Predominantly, people who were involved with environmental activism had come in to share their feedback, but all of a sudden, there was a very different group which had a perspective on the particular legislation. Now, our endeavor at Civis, and I can only speak from our experience here, but our endeavor at Civis has actually been to represent. So we don't actually pick, we don't say that this is right or that is right. It's just a platform for representation to say this is what we have found out, right? How does it work together? So I think that's where it comes back to the first question on representative democracy, right? It actually has to work together based on a number of internal constraints of the government as well. What is it that is practically feasible? What is it that is cost effective? What is it that is possible within a certain time frame? And I think that actually ends up meddling or adding that balance to what citizens have to say on a particular consultation, right? Yeah, I think I'll pause there, but I think that's partly why I was also saying that direct democracy needs a level of maturity that perhaps we may not have at the moment.
So since we're running out of time, I'm just quickly going to take last three questions and then we'll close the floor. So something about social media. The question says, do you think social media can counter civic technology? And how can it be made more accessible to people, as in the smartphones, and considering how expensive they are and they are not so accessible to the poorest of the poorest? So,
Sure. So really interesting question. I think social media, yes, definitely can be accessed or seen as civic technology, though its entire use case may not be civic. Its entire use case is quite different, but it does have a realm, and especially Twitter, for example, has actually boosted the government's ability to reach out to people. So in that respect, yes, I would agree. When it comes to social media accessibility, there are a number of organizations, for example, one called Gramvani, which is working on community social media based on IVRS, right? So you can actually call in, record a message, and CGNet Swara as well that does this. You can call in, record a message, and sing a song and kind of hang up, and the next person will call in, and then they'll hear your song and they'll be able to record another song and sort of send it out, right? So there are different ways. I know that, and I don't remember the name of this exactly, but I remember that Twitter was at some point contemplating how to make tweets appear on text messages and vice versa. Not very up to date on what happened there, but there are ways to make this, to make the words meet.
perfect. So the last couple of questions, I think I can combine them and it could sort of be like a closing remark for you as well. So what would you say are some of the key policy challenges to make progress in India? And over the years, since you've been working in this space so widely and you've given such amazing insights to us, do you see people getting more engaged in policy process over the last few years?
Sure. So I think on the first question, I know all of us have our laundry list of what we think, and I'm probably not that equipped to be in that position to be able to answer that question. But I think one of the interesting things is really that we have some good laws on paper. How do we take them beyond the sheet of paper and actually ensure that they are implemented? I think all of us as individual citizens have a role to play in that process. And that is perhaps a lot more relevant than newer or snazzier legislation, right? I think what we have, how do we first kind of make sure that we're able to use it is one key question. Asta, sorry, could you repeat the second question?
It said, do you see people getting more engaged in the policy process over the years?
Absolutely. Completely. And I think it's been really fascinating to see. We have, for example, seen with the net neutrality movement, which was a few years ago, 2014-15, that had 1 million people come in and comment. The EIA, which had 2 million people come in and comment, right? So in the span of 5 years, you've actually seen a doubling in some way of engaging with policies. I do think that that is growing, and I think a lot of the curiosity around the space is really good. And Asa, like you mentioned as well, there has been a lot of questions that are being asked on how do we engage, how do we participate, and it's really inspiring to me.
Okay, thank you so much, Antaraa. I mean, this was an amazing conversation, and I'm sure participants also had fun listening to this and they asked so many questions. Before I just thank you and everything, participants, there's a feedback form on the chat box. My colleague has shared it with you. Please fill the feedback form. That's very important for us. That helps us structure our programs better in the future. Antaraa, with you, I mean, thank you for pointing out so many things which we just ignore while we are, discussing and reading about participant engagement, and especially during the pandemic. I thought pandemic was so much of a downside for so many organizations, but seeing people leverage through internet and making a whole nexus of engaging with the government, I think there are a few positive sides of the pandemic, and you rightly pointed that out. So thank you so much for that. And if you have anything to say to people or anything, it's over to you. Otherwise, we're good to close.
Thanks, Asta. I think Yazad also had something to say, but essentially, just wanted to thank you all for the interesting questions today and for the opportunity to speak. Do feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. And Asta, thanks so much for moderating today.
Sure. Antaraa, you can probably share your Twitter handle on the chat. And Yazad, you're on mute if you're speaking something.
Okay. I was going to thank Antaraa because she gave an absolutely fabulous presentation. I enjoyed every moment of it, and I learned quite a lot as well. Thank you, Asta, for moderating the questions so well, and for the entire CCS team who's been in the background.